Hello again. So this is a bit different. Actually, it's completely unrelated from the previous video that I did, but it contains a few thoughts that I felt might be worth sharing. On the topic of science, a friend asked me about the definition of science. And I've encountered this a lot lately. The last couple of years, maybe I'm just getting asked about it more. Because for some reason people have a perception of me as being somebody who might have an idea of what science is or isn't or whatever. And this may come as a shock to a lot of people because I know I am a very pedantic person about a lot of things. I get involved in semantic arguments and whatnot. And the goal with that is not just to be petty or to be obsessed with definitions, but rather to be obsessed with clarity. So my big thing is generally making sure that people are communicating about the same thing, or when they say a certain word to each other, they mean the same thing. And if they don't, that becomes clear. Now, there are certain things that are very, very well defined. For example, in the context of physics, a force is a certain thing, right? It's an influence on an object that can create an acceleration. And then you could even be more nuanced than that, if you wished. There are specific definitions of things, and those definitions have to be in place for the subject as a whole to make sense. The language, in other words, has to be in place. And I've noticed among many people whom I will collectively call science groupies, because that's a term that I use. I may have coined the term, actually. I don't know. I didn't know of anybody who used it before I did. But, among many of these people, there is this weird perception that science has a single exact definition. And shocker, no, it doesn't. I've encountered too many people who are well-established scientists, quote unquote, in their own right, in things that would be generally perceived, and I have to say generally because there is always room for interpretation, which is kind of the point here. People who are generally perceived as being very well established in hard sciences, who themselves don't wave this banner, they don't carry this torch, they don't consider this a fight worth having. They're too busy just doing what they do and kind of living and let live when it comes to, say, social sciences. But there are a lot of these like wannabe science warriors on the internet who like to, just rage and wave their pitchforks around when they see something that, according to their very, very limited understanding of the world, or at least the scientific world and academia, appears not to be scientific enough for their liking. Psychology is not real science. Well, which branch of psychology are you talking about? If you're just passing these kind of very blanket statements, broad sorts of judgments, well, okay, does that satisfy you to label things that way? I don't know that it helps anybody. Is that going to help them do their jobs better? Is it going to help you do your job better? Which feeds into this other thing that is very intelligent people seem nonetheless very uneasy with the idea of ambiguity. They for whatever reason, are not willing just to let there be different interpretations of something. That's strange to me. I don't understand why they're so bothered by it. Science can be this kind of grade school scientific method. You have a hypothesis, and then you form a plan for testing the hypothesis, and you draw conclusions based on careful measurements, blah, blah, blah. Sure, go for that. If you wish to define science that way, that's your right. More power to you. Recognize that it is not the only definition of it. I don't care how much you rant and rave and rail against what I'm saying. There are other interpretations that have some merit. And ultimately, I said this to my friend who was asking me this question, ultimately, on some level, every observation we make, every measurement we take, everything we do is subjective. There are just degrees of subjectivity. I don't care how controlled your equipment is, or how precise your equipment is, and how controlled your experiment is, how exacting you are, how many checks you put in place. You still, as a fallible human being, have to make observations of what those measurements are telling you, of what those instruments say, and the statistical analysis you might run. You have to draw conclusions in your very flawed primate brain about what those findings might mean. So there's still an element of subjectivity there. So if we try to say that, well, real science is objective and non-real science or fake science or pseudoscience or whatever is more subjective, no, you're missing the point. You can do science and have it be subjective. That I don't know of any legitimate established scientist who would really argue with that. There might be some, but the vast majority I've met, at least, are okay with observation that is subjective. You just got to acknowledge it. You have to understand that there are limitations to any methodology that you use. And you would hope, because maybe your methods are, at least in other ways, as reproducible as possible, other people can repeat it and use their subjective interpretation. And then you see where all the subjective interpretations overlap. And that might be the best possible approximation one can get of the truth in that scenario with that question that's being asked. Maybe. But ultimately, again, science does not have one definition. There's the Popper definition about, or interpretation revolving around falsifiability. Some people say it's not a scientific question if it's not based around a falsifiable claim. But I've heard very compelling arguments that falsifying things is not always or even usually the goal of good science. It may be, but it may not be. It depends on how you interpret certain aspects of the definition and how you look at the methods that are out there that are used. And another thing that's a big misconception, I need, not that I'm going to put this to bed because I'm nobody, but people act as though controls are the determining factor. Oh, you do an experiment. No. There are tons of science out there that is not experimental. If you limit it only to experiment, then a lot of things that you have taken for granted as being the result of science would have to be thrown out the window. Okay? A lot of these same science warriors will say, believe climate scientists. Okay? So you're saying that climate science is a real science. Yet, a lot of that stuff is based on observation and modeling. Not by experimentation. We're not doing controlled experiments with global weather systems. So again, you have to understand enough about science to understand that sometimes the definition changes. Or at least the definition is broader than your initial introduction to the idea might suggest. Physicists. Physics is often seen as the hardest science out there, or one of them. Change my camera focus here. One of the hardest sciences imaginable, yet certain aspects of physics are purely observational. No experimentation. Hell, look at astrophysics or astronomy, right? We're not controlling anything in terms of what these heavenly bodies are doing. We are just looking and making super careful observations, and then we're trying to make predictions. So that's another thing about science. Some people will say science has to make predictions. Maybe. There are arguments that can be made that you can have a useful scientific endeavor without predictions being made. Just having you understand things. Now, it kind of depends on your definition of prediction. If you mean, well, you can form a hypothesis about a mechanism, well, then maybe that's a sort of prediction, in which case then you broaden what would count as science. But here's my point, again, or one of my bigger points. There are different interpretations, and just because you want to feel confident that you are right doesn't mean that you are. You aren't proving anything, you're not winning any points, you're not scoring any points or winning any battles by fervently sticking to an overly rigid definition of a thing. I think in many cases, if you do that, you're missing the point. There are different ways to try to arrive at some approximation of the truth. Certain questions cannot be answered with careful instruments. Sometimes the apparatus for measurement just has to be messier. And just because you have this weird complex where you want to feel superior by saying that's not real science, well, you're not helping anyone. Maybe you're boosting your own ego or something. But I, as somebody who came from and tends to operate in reasonably hard-ish science, depending on which part of exercise science, quote unquote, you're talking about, I have no problem saying that sociology and psychology, at least certain arms of them, are scientific enough to be considered real science. And at the end of the day, whether you define it as science or not doesn't mean that they're useless. Like, if we change the definition of science, is it going to change how you apply methods? Is it going to change how you do what you do? I don't know that it will. So I don't concern myself with the exact definition. I have a personal definition that generally overlaps with a lot of interpretations out there, but I leave room for ambiguity. I leave some gray area. I think you should too. I think, to invoke the no true Scotsman fallacy a little bit here, I think true science requires that you be open to that ambiguity. You have to be comfortable enough with it to operate within it. If you're not okay with some degree of uncertainty, you're not doing science anyway. At least that's part of my definition. And you don't have to care about my definition. Because again, that's part of the point here. Anyway, done rambling about that. Still hope you're doing well. Give that some thought. See what it means to you.